So in this video, I'm going to show you how we can interact with objects by using raycasts. So I'll show you how we can shoot a gun to destroy objects and also how we can select objects. So as you can see up here in the scene view, if I hit E on my keyboard, I'm sending out a little green line, and if I shoot, I'm sending out a longer red line. So if I try to shoot this object, I can't because this object is set to be selectable. So if I move closer to it and I hit E on my keyboard, I get a little message in the lower hand corner, I got selected. And if I shoot these boxes, well, they explode and disappear. If I try to select them, however, I only get selected, which means the message that it sends when I click my button. So let's jump into the beginnings of this scene. First of all, the basics are that I have a starter asset. In this case, it's the capsule for a first-person controller. The setup here is I have a directional light. I've removed the standard main camera. I have the nested parent unpack here, which is the capsule version. Then there's a camera, a player follow camera, and the capsule itself, and we're on a plane. This plane is just a standard plane, and it has a scale of 10 by 10 by 10. So we will need to set up this entire scene to have a weapon and some destructible objects and interactable objects. First of all, let's make the gun. The gun is going to be part of the camera itself. So right click the camera, create an empty object. I'm going to call it weapon position for the weapon position on the body of the controller. I'm going to hit W on my keyboard and I'm going to move out this empty game object so that it hovers just outside of the controller. In the weapon here, I'm going to right click on that. I'm going to go to 3D object and add a cube, and I'm going to rename it gun. Then I will hit R on my keyboard and make it a lot smaller so that it just becomes a little square that I can see. So this should now be possible for us to click the weapon position, hit W, and then move this into the field of view as a gun in a game would. I'm going to lock my aspect ratio down here to 16 by 9 so that I get a bit of a field of view for how a normal 16 by 9 game would look. So if I jump into play mode now, I am able to move around. However, if I look down, the collider on the box is going to push my object backwards, meaning I don't really want that because it just essentially works like if I am standing on a step. So we need to kind of go in and fix that. So first of all, out of play mode, I'm going to click the asset called gun, and I'm going to go into the box collider here in the inspector, click it, and then remove the component. We don't need anything to be on that gun. Let's start by getting into the input system settings so that we can set some inputs for our shooting and our selecting. You actually need to find the input system settings over here in your project. So if we go in here and we unpack starter assets, so inside of the input system here, you should find the starter assets. And if you click this one, you should be able to over here in the inspector see an edit asset button. When you click this edit asset button, you should get the input actions window open. Let's start by adding an action. So you can right click here, add an action. This action is going to be called shoot. Currently has no binding. So let's go in and change that. So the path here for binding, I'm going to go in, I'm going to select my mouse. I'm going to go with the left button for shooting. Then I'm going to add another binding by just clicking the plus here or right clicking, adding new button. This one is going to be called select. In the binding for this, I'm going to go into the bindings. I'm going to select keyboard. I'm going to go to the by character map to key, and I'm going to find the character E. So now if I hit E on my keyboard, I am sending the select request. And if I'm clicking the mouse button left, then I'm going to send the shoot option. So this doesn't auto save. So remember to click save asset so that it updates the asset itself. And then you can close that window again. So next, what we want to do is we want to set up our script for shooting. The script for both shooting and selection is going to be mostly just the same, but we will be differentiating some names between these two. But we'll put the scripts on the player capsule. So let's just go to the bottom of the player capsule asset here, click add component. And in this case here, we'll call this the shooter. Add it as a new script. Now in the bottom of this, there should be an empty script called shooter. Double click it, please. We won't need any of the standard boilerplates, so we'll just remove the start and the update methods. However, we will need some extra libraries up here. So start by adding Unity Engine.input system. Now let's set up some variables that we need for our class here. The first one is going to be a public layer mask. We'll call it layers to shoot. And let's start by setting it to a -1. Next is going to be the distance that we want to shoot. So set a public float value. We'll say shot distance, and we'll just set it to 25 as a standard. Then let's set up the camera. We'll just call it cam. Then we want a public particle system, and we'll call it hit particles. And finally, we just want a bit of sound. So public audio source.shot sound. So now we need to figure out if our shot input value has been triggered. So let's set up a public, in this case void method. We'll call it on shoot. This is going to listen for an input value, and that input value we'll just call value. So now what we will be looking for here is if our value, so the input value dot is pressed, then we want it to essentially fire some code. We haven't built anything yet to be triggered, so let's just start by adding a debug code here. So debug.log, and in the parentheses here, we'll just write shoot. So after the public void on shoot, we need our main part of this function. So let's set up a private method. It's again a void, no return values. We'll just call it shoot with no parameters. And then in here, we need to start by setting up some positions to figure out where this raycast that we want to send out is going to be sending out from and where it's going to hit. So first, let's set up a vector 3. Let's call it ray start. We'll set it equal to the cam.transform.position. Another vector 3, we'll call it ray direction, and we'll say cam.transform.forward. So in the forward facing direction. To be able to see this line inside of the both the game, so in the scene view, but when we play the game, so that when we shoot it, we can see that line that it emanates from the camera's vantage point. We'll set up a debug. It's just going to be a debug ray, so a narrow little line that we can see. So debug.draw the ray, and this ray here needs the ray start. So that is true. It needs the ray direction, but instead of just getting the standard direction and the standard like ray, we'll say ray direction times our shot distance. And then because we have some other factors that we can add in, we can, for instance, add a color. We'll say color.red in this case. And then how long should it be displayed? Well, for 1 second, please. So 1 float. Now we'll set up the raycast portion of this. So we'll say raycast hit. We'll just call it hit. Then we'll set up an if statement. So if, in this case, we'll say physics.raycast. And this will need a few parameters. So inside of the raycast here, we need to have our where the raycast emanates from. That's our ray start. Then we need to give it a direction. So that's the ray direction. Then it needs to know what the raycast should do. It should go outwards and it should return a hit. Then it needs a specific distance that it is enabled to travel. In this case, the 25, which we can then change out in the inspector. And then of course, it also needs to know what it's allowed to shoot. In this case, layers to shoot. This is something that we can set up in the inspector as well. So now some effects that we would like to add in this case, so the particles and the sound. So let's just set up a few if statements for this. So if the hit particles are equal to null, well, then instantiate the hit particles, and we'll just say it the hit dot point, which will then instantiate the hit particles at the hit specific point. And we also want a specific rotation. So in this case, we'll use the quaternion angle to instantiate it. So next up, we'll check if the sound is played. So if shot sound is not equal to null, then find the audio source. We'll set up a new sound for it. We'll instantiate the shot sound at the shot sound, and then just transform position for this given object, which is on our body. So we'll hear it close to us. And again, we'll say quaternion.identity. Then just to clean up after ourselves, we'll say destroy new sound.gameObject, and also the new sound.clip.length. So that should completely empty out the shot sound. So next up is we'll set up a hittable object. We'll set it equal to hit.transform.getComponent and hittable. So this is going to make sense in just a moment when we have the hittable object made into a script as well. So after this hittable setup, we'll say if the hittable object, I need to respell this, is not equal to null, then say hittable object dot hit. And I'm missing another bracket here. So now let's set up the hittable object itself. So let's jump back into Unity. We will have a compiler. We'll fix that in just a minute. Make a new 3D object, make it a cube in this case. I will reset its position and I'll put it out here in front. I'm going to add a new component to it. I'm going to call it hittable with a capital H. So in this script here, again, we'll remove all of this boilerplate stuff that we have here. Again, we want to add some extra libraries here. So using Unity Engine.events, which is going to give us access to the full event system so that we can, in the inspector, trigger some specific Unity event. We'll start by setting up a public Unity event, and we'll just call it got_hit. So in this case, we'll then set up the function that we just called in the other script. So we'll say public void hit with a capital H, no parameters, curly brackets, and then we'll say got_hit, and then invoke, meaning it would trigger our current Unity event got_hit. So save this. So back in the code here, we now have our shot function that we also need to call along with our debug log here. On the line just below our debug log, we'll just call the shoot function. So let's save now and let's jump back into Unity again. Now, as you can see, we don't have any compilers, so no red messages down there, no red flags. The object here is functional. It has a got hit, but the list is currently empty. So in this case, let's just try to have the cube destroy itself if it gets hit. So we'll just click the plus button here in the hittable object. We'll drag the cube itself into its own object slot right here. We'll go to the no function. We'll say game object and then just set active as a Boolean so that it's off, meaning that if it gets hit right now, it's just going to turn itself off. So with that set up, let's jump into the player capture. We need to give it some information inside of our new script down here. So layers to shoot currently set to everything. So everything can be hit, which is fine for now. It needs to know what the camera is. So we'll take our main camera, we'll drag that into that camera option. The hit particles and the shot sound haven't been defined yet, but it should probably work without. So let's just try to play. We are now able to send this red line across, as you can see up here in the scene view. I can't see anything in my game view. But if I go and I shoot the box right in front of me, it disappears because that hittable object thing gets triggered. So for the sake of simplicity, I have a file here with some assets in it. This is just a bunch of audio clips. It's a prefab for some particles. So I'm going to import that. Any particle system here will work and any sound playback device thing will also work. So now inside of game effect, I can now take the shoot sound. I can drag that onto my sound playback here and I can take my shoot spark and put that into the hit particles like so. And now anything I shoot will show these particles. And of course, if I hit this one, it also gets shot. So I'm not recording the sound from the computer right now, but you might be able to hear it through my microphone. So in the next video, I'm going to show you how we tweak this shooting thing into a selector. Thank you for watching, everyone.